I woke up mid-sleep and said, without thinking, "You want a coffee, love?" And Claire, my wife, laughed so hard she nearly slid off the bed. It was one of those laugh-out-loud surprised laughs you only get when something small and impossible happens, and I stood there blinking, trying to understand why her reaction hit me like a slap. I felt half asleep, the room still thick with night, but the sound of my own voice had a clarity and an edge I didn't own. It wasn't mine. It was someone else's voice coming out of my mouth, crisp and fast, like the presenters on the late-night shows I used to listen to for insomnia. I grabbed the duvet and tried to write it off as a weird joke, but the buzzing in my skull made jokes hard. "Cut it out," she managed between breaths, wiping tears from her eyes. "Are you pranking me?" I tried to imitate my normal Ohio drawl, slow, flat, the way my family could always place me on a map, but what came out was a bad, strained version that sounded like an American doing a British impression. When I tried again, the words were clean, clipped, and unquestionably Southeast London. Claire's smile froze into a face I couldn't read. "You're pulling my leg," she said, but she wasn't sure. I told her straight up, "I can't make my old voice happen, I don't know what's going on." Saying it aloud made the room colder. My tongue felt foreign against my teeth, like someone had rearranged the inside of my mouth while I slept. We sat up and tried to reason it out. At first we laughed, because laughter is a cheap shield against fear, and because the idea of me talking like a Londoner in the middle of Ohio seemed ridiculous. Then the humor drained fast. I called my boss from the kitchen so he wouldn't hear any accent in person. My head felt full of static and the words felt borrowed, and we said I had laryngitis. Claire covered for me on the phone, her voice steady, making the story believable. She told him I couldn't talk without pain, that my throat was raw, and he said, "Fine, take the day." Hanging up, Claire looked at me and said, "Well, that buys you a day to sort this out." The buzz inside me didn't care about a day. It kept humming like a faulty transformer. I tried everything I could think of to force myself back. I watched old home videos to prove to myself that the other voice was me once. My parents' footage of backyard barbecues, me at a wedding, a voicemail I left a year ago. My younger voice was all Ohio. My vowels rounded the way they should, my R's sat where they belonged. That made it worse. It made the new voice feel like a theft. I repeated phrases the way I always had, layered on coaxing and anger like a mechanic trying to fix an engine by whacking it. "Say tomato like you always do," I told myself out loud. The words came out different anyway. I felt stupid, like someone watching themselves in a badly directed film where the actor refuses to follow the script. Claire tried to keep the calm. She brewed 2 coffees and slid one toward me with that steady look spouses get when they need to be strong and practical at the same time. "Let's not freak out yet," she said, but I could hear it, her worry tucked underneath the words. I told her I felt fine otherwise. No pain, no numbness, no dizziness, just this impossible voice. I tried to think of causes that made sense. Maybe it was stress, maybe a weird sleep thing, maybe she'd laughed so hard she jostled something inside my head. None of those were answers, just small guesses to hold the worry at bay. We wrote a list on the fridge that night. Call the doctor, get an ear, nose, and throat check, check carbon monoxide, ask whether anyone had hypnotized me at the club last weekend. The list felt inadequate and too tidy for what was happening. As the morning light grew, the funny part of the situation evaporated and a dull, heavy fear set in. Claire kept asking me to try different words, to repeat things we both knew by heart, and each time the new voice came back smooth as water. My head kept scratching at the edges for an explanation and came up empty. By noon, my stomach did that hollow thing where you know the rest of the day will be hard. We dressed, fed the cat, and drove to urgent care with that quiet, fragile silence couples have when one of them holds a secret they can't fix alone. I kept hearing my own words in my head, spoken in an accent that belonged on a train into London, and I had no idea how to make them stop. The ER brought in a neurologist because I kept insisting something was wrong, and he didn't waste time. He ordered an urgent MRI while I tried to sit still and pretend I wasn't terrified. I remember the tech sliding me into the tube and the machine making that steady, clanking sound that feels like a clock counting down. I tried to focus on my breath and on the idea that maybe they'd find a small, fixable thing, maybe a blade, a knot, anything that would explain why my tongue felt like it belonged to someone else. The scans came back the same afternoon. The neurologist sat across from us and said, "It's clean." He used the word like it was supposed to be comforting. No infarct, no hemorrhage, no tumor, no structural damage. The word clean didn't land like comfort. It landed like a locked door. They ran everything else they could think of. Blood panels, autoimmune screens, allergy tests, the resident told me while Claire waited in the hall and pretended to read a magazine. I remember a nurse drawing vials of my blood and a tech tapping a keyboard like the answers would show up on the screen. Every test returned normal. Lyme negative, thyroid fine, electrolytes steady, inflammation markers low. The lab results felt like an echo, important, clinical, but not the one I needed. The more I looked for a physical cause, the more the silence of those tests felt like a verdict of we don't know. I sat in the small exam room and kept saying to myself out loud and under my breath, there has to be something wrong. There has to be a reason. When the neurologist shrugged and said he'd like a psychiatric consult just to cover all bases, I heard the weight of the suggestion like a gavel hitting wood. A psychiatrist came recommended and listened to my story without flinching. She had the kind of voice that cataloged everything with neutral language. After a long pause, she suggested conversion disorder as a possibility. Your brain might be producing physical symptoms in response to stress, she said. She explained it carefully, like a teacher lecturing a class you didn't know you were in. I took the script home with me in my head and read it over in the middle of the night, hoping the words would make me better. They didn't. She prescribed an anti-anxiety medication and suggested therapy. We tried the meds for 6 weeks. I watched the calendar and counted pills, but my voice didn't change. The Southeast London patterns kept slanting my vowels, no matter how small the dose or how steady the intake. The meds didn't just fail to fix me, they became another wedge between Claire and me. I could see the patience draining out of her like water from a sink. One night, after a week of nerves frayed so thin we could both feel them, she announced she needed space and moved into the guest room. She folded her arms, said, "I can't keep doing this," and carried a small suitcase out without looking back. I remember the silence left behind like a physical thing, heavy and unfamiliar. She told our friends she needed time to think and to stop feeling like she was being manipulated, and a few believed her. It hurt more than I expected. Her leaving made me feel smaller and more exposed, like something essential had been removed. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Friends tried to help in ways that sounded reasonable at first and desperate later. Marcus, who runs the comedy nights we sometimes attend, joked at first that maybe I'd been hypnotized on stage. Maybe someone planted a seed, he said, half smiling as if a prank could ever be that precise. We called the club, they were adamant. No hypnotist on that bill, the club manager told us. He even checked his notes twice. Another buddy suggested carbon monoxide poisoning. We called the fire inspector to run a detector. He came, clipped a little meter to the wall, and paced the house like he was on a job he did 100 times. The readout was normal. He shook his head and said, "I've never seen Co show up as an accent change." It felt like everyone was running through a checklist of what could be obvious, and each check mark turned into another dead end. It wasn't just tests and techs and friends suggesting outlandish theories. It was the slow collapsing of certainty. Each impossible answer pushed us into another loop of speculation. Specialists kept saying the same kind of thing. We can't locate a physical lesion and consider neurofunctional causes, and therapy and rehab may help. Each phrase sounded like an attempt to be helpful, but the gap between clinical suggestion and a real human voice that sounded like mine kept widening. I was left carrying a body that read normal on every test and a voice that felt stolen, and Claire was carrying the suspicion that maybe I wanted attention. The house felt too big for two people to split. The friend group started to shift. My life narrowed to rooms with fluorescent lights and waiting chairs, and to the small, stubborn hope that someone would find the missing explanation. The speech therapist was the first person to point out that something stranger than an accent was happening, and when she said it, I felt a cold little click inside my chest. She told me I wasn't just borrowing sounds, my grammar and spelling inside my head were shifting too. "You're using British constructions," she said, tapping a tablet. "You're thinking whilst and preferring color with a U." I laughed a bit because it sounded absurd, then tried to stop saying whilst and watched it reappear like a reflex. It wasn't just what I spoke out loud. It was the way I formed sentences in my head. I started composing emails with British idioms without realizing why, then rereading them and feeling like an imposter in my own inbox. At work, the change mattered more than I expected. I hadn't grasped how much my identity was built into my voice until a client called and said they wanted an American representative. The client, a large company managing a long-term contract, insisted on an American face and voice for their brand. They called Claire and told her directly they'd feel uncomfortable with a representative who sounded as if they were calling from London. The account manager in me tried to explain that a voice doesn't equal loyalty or competence, but the client wasn't asking for logic. They were asking for familiarity. They canceled a $1,300,000 contract on the spot. I watched as a partnership I'd nurtured for years folded in a single phone call. That call felt like a kind of violent proof that the change had real, expensive consequences. My firm handled it the way companies do when a client walks. HR called me in and used that whole formal voice that makes everything sound smaller. "We have to think about the brand," they said. "The client has requested an American representative. We can't risk the account." They let me go that afternoon. I remember the paper they handed me like it was a verdict. Being fired was a blunt, awful thing. I left the office with my box of belongings, Claire waiting at the curb, her eyes careful and unreadable. Losing the job wasn't just a financial blow. It felt like the last proof to people who already doubted me that maybe I was different in a bad way. We tried other explanations that felt plausible at first. I thought maybe a dental procedure had something to do with it. I'd been to a naval dentist for a filling right before this started, and the idea that anesthesia or nerve irritation could have scrambled my speech seemed reasonable. The dentist called back, reviewed the chart, and assured me it was standard local anesthetic, nothing unusual. I wanted to cling to that explanation, but it fell apart under scrutiny. We tested the house for carbon monoxide yet again, just to be certain. The inspector shrugged, the readouts were normal. We sent samples, we sat in exam rooms across the state and then across the country. Specialists tested me for Lyme disease, parasites, autoimmune markers, heavy metals, everything a long list of doctors could think to test. Each result came back negative. I started to feel like a broken machine people were poking and prodding, and every normal test became its own kind of cruelty, proof that nothing physically was wrong in the usual sense. The longer the normal answers piled up, the more everyone's patience thinned. Friends and family didn't all react the same way. Some stayed stubbornly close, helping with calls and paperwork and driving me to appointments, while others drifted away, unable to hold on to what they thought they understood about me. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter grew taller. The mortgage didn't care about diagnostics or explanations. Legal letters started arriving after the firing, paperwork the company sent out as routine protection. Claire and I signed separation papers after fights that weren't dramatic, just long and weary, each one a small chipping away at trust. She moved a box into the guest room and then called a lawyer. The paperwork felt like a slow collapse. I sat at the table at night with those forms spread out and felt a sudden, hard vertigo. Everything I built was unspooling. I tried to keep my days organized because chaos made the accent louder in my head. I set alarms, made lists, kept a journal where I wrote the same short sentence in different accents just to feel control. I am me, I'd write. I am me. Writing helped a little, until the British spelling sneaked back in and I caught myself defending color on a note that should have felt purely private. Money started to pinch in ways that made every small decision heavy. I canceled subscriptions, negotiated payment plans, and watched credit card balances grow. The jobless gap made me more vulnerable than I'd ever been. When friends asked what they could do, I told them the truth. We need time, we need patience, and we need answers. Mostly we got silence and then small, practical offers, meals, a ride to a test that helped but could not stitch the past back together. 6 months into this madness, I got a message from a persistent speech pathologist who had been quietly digging through old literature. And she told me she'd found cases from the 1960s that sounded like my story. She called herself a speech pathologist the first time she emailed me, clinical matter of fact, and she wrote, "You should meet the physician who documented them." Claire didn't come with me, she'd already moved out and needed space, so I drove alone, the highway long and quiet, my voice humming in my head like a radio stuck between stations. The trip felt like an act of faith and desperation at once. I kept replaying her message: 3 cases, sudden British accent, intense stressors. That short sentence pulled me forward like a rope. When I arrived at the small house in the countryside, I saw first how old he was. The man who opened the door called himself a retired physician, and I said it out loud, retired physician, because roles mattered now like labels on hospital jars. He was frail, shoulders curved, eyes bright but guarded, and he moved with the careful, internal rhythm of someone who had lived with a lot of thinking. I told him my name in the way people do when they don't want to lose formality. And I felt the accent settle into my mouth like a second skin. He blinked and led me into a cramped living room that smelled faintly of tea and paper. We talked for a long time, slow at first, then faster as stories make room for one another. He asked about work, about stress, about whether I'd had any head injury, and he listened without that modern, quick judgment of psychosomatic that I'd felt in earlier offices. Then he shuffled to a shelf and pulled down a battered notebook with a bent spine and yellowed pages. He sat back down, thumbed the notebook open like it was a relic, and read a page aloud to himself, muttering the way old doctors do when they are checking the wiring of their memories. I watched his face close around the words, like someone fitting a key into a lock. Finally, he tapped the page, his hands steady, and said 4 words that hit harder than any MRI report. Functional neurological disorder syndrome, he read, and then he spoke them again in that slow, weathered voice that had seen 100 confusing cases. He'd written it down years ago, a label for a cluster of symptoms he couldn't explain with scans or blood work. He explained in plain terms, no fancy jargon, that he'd seen 3 patients in the 1960s who developed sudden British-like accents after going through extreme life stress. Bankruptcy, divorce, burned-out careers. He'd tracked them over years and kept notes in that notebook, notes that looked like a map of stubborn human behavior. He told me something that felt like a warning and a gift at once. The patients who resisted the new voice the hardest tended to remain stuck. He tapped the page where he'd drawn progress charts in tiny, careful handwriting and said, "Those who fought it, who insisted on proof and control and kept flaying at the symptoms, rarely improved." It stung to hear it because my instinct had been to fight tooth and nail for a fix. The idea that fighting might make it worse didn't feel fair, but his tone carried the weight of long observation, not opinion. He described FND, functional neurological disorder, in a way that simplified the complex. "Think of the brain like a computer," he said, hands folded. "The hardware is fine, the wiring is okay, but the software can glitch under sudden heavy loads. It may start running old programs that don't match the system we expect. People hear accents, move in odd ways, or can't feel parts of their body even though scans are clear." The metaphor made sense in a gut-level way. It explained the clean MRI and the loud, wrong voice coming out of me. It also made the problem sound less like trickery and more like a malfunction that deserved patient work, not blame. We talked about his long-term notes, the charts showing who improved and who didn't, and he was blunt about reality. Recovery could take years and stubborn resistance often locked symptoms in place. Yet he wasn't without hope. He had observed patients who, with the right kind of therapy that combined speech work and acceptance, made steady progress. He emphasized that panic and anger tended to feed the symptom by adding stress, which is the fuel this glitch seems to run on. "Stress flips the circuit," he said simply. It felt like a roadmap and a cautionary tale rolled into one. Driving back that evening, the road blurred into a ribbon of lights, and I felt oddly lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because there was finally a name that fit something, a bridge between my experience and other documented cases. Heavier because the name meant a long road ahead where patience and strategy mattered more than quick fixes. I kept the image of the yellowed notebook in my head like a relic that proved I wasn't entirely alone. The retired physician's words settled in me. If I wanted a chance at change, I had to stop battering against the problem and start learning how to work with it. It was not a cure, but it was direction, and after months of dead ends, that felt like the most useful thing I'd been given. Back home, I met with Dr. Gina Harper, a linguistics researcher who said she wanted to run a full acoustic and syntactic battery to see what was going on. She set up microphones in a tiny office that smelled like coffee and old paper and told me not to worry, just talk. I felt the usual prick of shame talking about myself like a specimen, but I also felt a sliver of hope. "Just say whatever comes to mind," she said, and the microphones hummed like a calm interrogation. I started talking about my morning routine, about cereal, about the cat, and she clicked buttons and watched the screens. Gina explained everything she was doing as she worked, which made me less nervous. "We'll look at spectrograms, vowel space charts, timing," she said, pointing at lines and bright blobs that meant nothing to me at first. She put my voice into software and pulled up graphs that made my sentences look like mountains and rivers. I watched as she zoomed in on my R sounds and the shape of my vowels. "Listen to this," she said, and played a short clip. Hearing my voice through playback was strange and sharp, like the sound belonged to someone else and I was listening in on them. Gina smiled, not in a dismissive way but like someone who'd found an interesting piece to a puzzle. "This is precise," she said. "The dropped rhotics here match Southeast London patterns. Your vowels shift in the same spots we'd expect for that area." She ran through the mechanics plainly, the way a scientist would. You drop your R after vowels, your vowel space shifts toward fronting in specific contexts, and the timing, the stress patterns align with Southeast London rhythm. She pulled up comparison examples from native speakers and from speakers across Britain. The match wasn't vague, the match was tight. She even pointed to tiny markers that, to her training, suggested neighborhood-level features. "There are neighborhood-specific phonetic markers here," Gina said, tapping the screen. "It's not just British, it's Southeast London. The pattern is internally consistent." I felt a strange mix of relief and alarm. Relief at having objective proof, alarm because the proof sounded so exact it made the impossible feel official. Gina didn't stop at acoustics. She tested my grammar and word choices, asking me to describe pictures and tell short stories. She kept notes as I spoke and wrote, and after a while she said something that made my stomach drop. My syntax and lexis had shifted too. I started using constructions like have got in places I never would, and I picked up British preposition patterns and certain British vocabulary without thinking. She showed me examples on a sheet. I had used whilst once, spelled color in a draft, and used proper in a way my old self wouldn't. You're not only producing phonetic markers, Gina said, your internal language model seems to be operating with British rules. I tried to laugh it off, but the laugh came out in the same accent and Gina just nodded. She asked about my listening habits, and I told her about the late-night podcasts and TV shows I'd watched for years to pass time, voices from Britain bleeding into the background of my drives and insomnia. Gina leaned back and connected dots out loud. Language exposure leaves traces, she said. You can store patterns without realizing it. Under normal conditions, those traces are small. But under heavy stress, the brain might recruit a stored pattern as a functional shortcut. She used the word functional like she meant useful, not fake. Think of the brain like a system with layers of probabilities. Under stress, the system can increase the weight of less used patterns. Your brain seems to have activated a British language pattern that had been quietly building from years of exposure. Her explanation made a kind of sense in a clearing out the house way. It suggested the brain wasn't broken in the way MRIs show, but that its software had reweighted inputs and flipped to a different internal model. It's like a backup system taking over, she said, and the phrase stuck in my head because it sounded both mechanical and oddly human. Gina showed me the data again, slow and deliberate, the spectrograms and timing charts lit up like a map. We can document this objectively, she said. It's not imagination or a prank, your speech aligns with a specific linguistic system. I asked her quietly if this could be reversed or retrained. She didn't promise cures, she shouldn't have, but she was practical. We can do targeted therapy, she said, speech training, rhythm work, and cognitive exercises, but we should also address stress and guard against fight responses which often lock symptoms in place. The balance she suggested, technical work plus stress management, felt like the first concrete plan we'd had in months. For the first time since the MRI came back clean, I left a clinic with direction and a file of data that backed up what I was feeling. Gina's lab printed charts for me, pages that looked like proof and a map for the slow work ahead. Driving home, I replayed her words, backup system, reweighted inputs. It wasn't a cure, but it was an explanation that let me breathe a little differently. Francine Lowe, therapist, sat across from me the first time, and I remember thinking her hands looked steady in a way my life hadn't felt in months. She didn't say much at first, just watched me speak and nod, then she explained how she worked, not by trying to force the old accent back, but by teaching my brain to accept what was happening and slowly retrain the speech patterns. We're going to stop fighting the symptom directly, she said, calm and clear. That fight is like pouring fuel on a fire. Her voice was practical, not sentimental, and that felt like a relief after so many bounced opinions. Her plan had two parts that made sense to me immediately. One part was trauma work, the stuff people expect from therapy, memory processing, looking at stressors, and learning new ways to respond when panic rose. The other part was speech retraining, but gentle and graded, small drills, short-timed phrases, rhythm exercises that felt like practicing scales on a piano. She explained the reason plainly. The brain learns motor patterns through repetition, she said. But when it's stressed, repetition has to be smaller and kinder or the system locks in. It sounded simple when she explained it, but I knew my history of trying too hard. I had to unlearn that impulse. Francine had me do daily voice journals. The first week I recorded 2 minutes each morning, reading a short script and then talking about anything that came to mind. She would listen later and make notes. Record before caffeine if you can, she suggested, like a coach giving a small tip that mattered. I hated hearing myself on tape at first because the microphone made the voice feel like it belonged to someone walking past me. Still, the recordings became data I could watch. I could see patterns. After a night of bad sleep, the London features tightened. After a stressful phone call, they swelled like tidewater. When I slept decently and stayed calm, the features thinned. Those were small, encouraging signs. We practiced rhythm and intonation drills that sounded silly but worked on timing rather than sound. She had me clap out the beat of sentences and then speak to the beat. She taught me to notice where my stress was, literally which syllable got the emphasis, and how shifting the stress could change vowel shapes. There was repetition, but it was short. 5 minutes twice a day, she said. Not an hour. Too much drains your resources and paradoxically makes the brain revert to the old pattern. It felt counterintuitive to work less, but the tiny sessions kept me from burning out. We also did trauma processing in parallel. Francine had me walk through heavy moments without judgment, naming the stressors that had stacked up before my voice changed. The late nights, the pressure at work, the fight about money, the denial from people close to me. She used memory reconsolidation techniques to reduce the charge of those events. The symptom feeds on the charge, she said. When you reduce the charge, the symptom has less fuel. Saying the events out loud in her office stole some of their power. It didn't make them vanish, but it made them less sharp when they showed up in my chest. There were tiny victories that felt huge. One evening I was at home reciting a nursery rhyme we used to say with our niece, and for a second half a bar a word came out in my old Midwestern way. I stopped and listened to the recording and played it back 5 times like someone who'd found a lost coin. I told Francine about that moment and she smiled the way she did when anything moved forward. "Celebrate it," she said. "Recognize it as evidence your system can access different patterns." That one small reversion became a touchstone. It didn't mean the whole problem was solved, but it meant the neural pathways were not erased. Francine warned me repeatedly not to overdo it. When people try to brute force their old voice by hours of practice or by angrily correcting every slip, they often make things worse, she said. The brain interprets that as increased threat. She used phrases like fight response and symptom consolidation that sounded clinical but described how my own stubbornness had been making the problem stick. That was hard to admit. I had always believed grit fixed everything. Here, grit could be the obstacle. Her acceptance work changed how I reacted when the British pattern took over. Instead of panicking and trying to claw back my old voice immediately, I learned to note it. "That's the Southeast London pattern," I'd tell myself quietly, and then shift to a small breathing exercise or a 2-minute drill. That pause reduced the immediate spike of stress. Over weeks, those pauses added up. The British features still appeared, especially when I was tired or hit with bad news, but their hold loosened in small, invisible ways. The work didn't feel glamorous. It was many small, boring practices done day after day, plus the painful work of naming what hurt. But the rhythm of it gave me back a measure of control. Claire still had her doubts and lived in the guest room for a while, but I was doing something that made sense to me and to the clinicians helping me. Francine's approach taught me the hard lesson that acceptance wasn't surrender. It was a tool that could shrink the symptom's power and open room for change over time. Ross, our labor attorney, told me straight away that we had a case worth fighting and that he would push for a fair settlement. He explained the process in plain terms, document everything, use the medical tests, the speech analyzes, and build a file showing this was a disability, not willful misconduct. He worked like someone who'd done this before, calm and steady, and I felt relieved to have a professional take the lead. The negotiations took weeks of back-and-forth calls and emails, and I sat in parking lots listening to voicemails, voice recordings playing between clinic appointments. In the end, we secured a settlement big enough to keep the lights on and to avoid immediate homelessness, and it included a neutral reference so I wouldn't be blacklisted from future work. That piece of paper felt like oxygen. With that safety net, I started looking for work differently. I widened the search and accepted remote roles I would never have considered before. One British startup reached out after seeing my materials and the speech recordings Dr. Gina had done. They offered me a trial period to see if I'd fit into their customer-facing team. I told them I spoke differently now and that the recordings reflected my current speech patterns. They said that was fine, in fact it helped. "Our clients feel heard," their recruiter said, sounding honest and oddly relieved to find someone comfortable engaging a London audience. The trial worked. My accent matched the client's expectations and made conversations easy in ways none of my old pitches did anymore. The startup hired me after the trial and offered steady remote work with benefits. It felt strange at first to have a European company sign a contract with a Midwesterner who spoke like Southeast London. But the job meant stability and a chance to rebuild. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment not far from the city. It was smaller than my old house and quieter in a different way. The space gave me a place to focus on therapy and work without the daily reminders of the life that had unraveled. I set up a little corner office with a microphone, a bookshelf, and the charts Gina had printed. The new place felt manageable. I learned how to budget on the settlement and my new salary, and I made a schedule that included work, therapy, and the small tasks that keep a life moving forward: groceries, laundry, bills. The routine helped steady my days in a way I hadn't expected. I also started showing up to FND support groups both online and in person. The groups were a mix of people with strange neurological symptoms and the clinicians who helped them, and I finally felt less alone. I listened to stories that were familiar and different, and I shared my recordings and the data Gina had collected. People thanked me for the level of detail I provided about acoustic analysis and therapy strategies. The groups became a kind of lab for lived experience, a place to test coping ideas and to find people who didn't doubt the reality of my condition. That kind of acceptance was new and oddly freeing. Writing became another outlet. I started a blog and wrote articles for patient education materials that Francine and Gina helped circulate. I wrote in plain language about how stress can reweight the brain's internal models and how acceptance-based therapy can reduce symptom intensity. I posted short voice clips with captions explaining what the recordings showed, and I wove in the clinical documentation so readers could see the medical side as well as the human side. My work reached people who were frustrated by doctors who said, "There's nothing wrong," without offering direction. Emails started piling into my inbox from others with unexplained symptoms, and I answered as often as I could. Family repair was slow but real. My sister and father reached out first after I sent them a package with recordings, Gina's acoustic reports, and interviews Francine had given about therapy. They listened in ways that made my chest unclench. My mother took longer. Old habits of doubt were hard to break. Over time, though, recorded medical documentation and interviews helped them understand this was a recognized condition, not a stunt or a mood. Small invitations followed, a dinner, then a weekend visit, each one tentative but meaningful. Rebuilding trust felt like work, but also like a relief I hadn't known I needed. The neutral reference Ross negotiated helped too. It meant future employers could trust the official story of why I left my old job. That plus the steady paycheck from the London startup and the settlement created a runway long enough for therapy to do what it could. I kept up the daily voice journals Francine recommended and the short retraining drills. Sometimes the old voice would surge when I was tired or stressed, but the frequency and intensity decreased over time. The combination of legal help, new work, therapy, and community made my life steadier. I didn't get everything back. The old Lifehouse steady in-person job, the easy assumptions people had about me wasn't going to snap back into place. But I found new routines, new work that fit this strange reality and a purpose in helping others navigate the same confusing path. In the quiet of the apartment at night, with charts on the wall and a microphone on the desk, I learned how to live with a voice that was unexpected and yet in its own way real. 3 years after Claire laughed that morning, my life looked very different but steady in ways I hadn't thought possible. I woke up to a routine now, a short breathing practice, 5 minutes of rhythm drills, then work calls with clients in London. I still record a quick voice journal most mornings, not out of fear, but because the recordings remind me how far I've come. Francine cut our sessions down slowly. "You know the drills," she said the first time she reduced them, folding her hands like she always does. "Now it's about integration, using your tools in the wild." I trusted her enough to let the appointments taper, which felt like a quiet vote of confidence in me. When Francine reduced how often I came in, she taught me longer-term strategies for when the British pattern tightened. "Make small changes early," she'd tell me. "Name it, breathe, do a 2-minute drill, then let it go." Those integration techniques worked better than brute force ever did. I learned to notice the feeling before my voice shifted, to take a step back from panic and treat the moment like any other skill to be used. My life still had flare-ups, late nights, arguments, the occasional client stress, but the episodes didn't swallow me the way they used to. They were disruptions I could manage instead of endless storms. Gina, the linguist, published the detailed acoustic study she had worked on with Francine and me. Dr. Gina Harper became a name I saw at conferences and in journal citations, and hearing her explain our case on a panel felt strange and validating. Her paper documented the accent features, the syntactic shifts, and the clear evidence linking long-term passive exposure to stored language patterns. The study didn't claim magic, it simply gave concrete data that helped other clinicians recognize what I'd gone through. When colleagues asked about the case, Gina was blunt and generous. "This is FND with linguistic features," she'd say. "It's rare, but it's real, and it deserves careful, evidence-based work." The academic attention mattered because it shifted the conversation from blame and doubt to treatment and study. Around that time, I met Sarah at a support group. She was listed on the group's message board as a facilitator and caller, and I remember her role because it felt important. She was calm and quick to listen, and when she introduced herself after the meeting, she said, "I found your blog helpful." We started meeting for coffee, then for walks, and then for small dinners. "I like how you tell your story," she said once, and I heard no pity in it, only curiosity. We built a life slowly and carefully, honoring each other's boundaries. Sarah had her own history with chronic neurological issues, so she understood the tempo of healing and the value of steady routines. We moved in together into an accessible apartment that had wide doorways and a quiet room that became my practice space. The apartment was smaller than the house I'd lost, but it felt right, a place designed for how we lived now. We married among friends who understood what chronic neurological conditions meant in practice, therapists, researchers, members of the FND community. It wasn't a big ceremony by old standards, but it was exactly what we needed. Honest, low-key, filled with people who didn't ask intrusive questions about what happened and who simply celebrated the life we chose together. "To quiet mornings," Sarah said when she toasted, and I felt the room relax into something steady. That wedding gave me another confirmation. I could create joy without pretending everything was fixed. Work stayed steady with the London company. My voice continued to match their clients' expectations, and oddly the accent that once cost me a job became an asset in remote work. I traveled once or twice a year for conferences, and people who'd only known me online were sometimes surprised in person. "You're from Ohio," they'd ask, and I'd laugh and tell the story, not as a scandal but as a medical and human truth. I always started with, "I used to speak with an Ohio drawl," and then explained FND, the tests, the therapies, and the research. People listened more than they expected to. The Southeast London voice remained, but it stopped feeling like a betrayal of who I was. It became one of many threads in how I introduced myself. I kept writing and contributing to patient education materials. My blog turned into a resource page, and Francine and Gina sometimes used my recordings for training new clinicians. "Real-world examples help people learn faster," Gina told me once, and I felt glad that my messy life could help others avoid the months of doubt and misdiagnosis I'd endured. I answered messages from people asking where to start, and I tried to be honest. Get medical workups, document everything, and find a clinical team that respects you. I added, do slow, acceptance-based work, fight less, practice more. Family mended slowly. My sister and father came to visit often, and my mother finally sat with me for tea and a long conversation where she asked more questions than accusations. "I didn't understand," she'd say sometimes, and that was the end of it. No hatred, just a gap closing. Claire and I never went back to how things were. We made peace in paper and in conversation. She and I exchanged a few careful texts, and once we met for coffee to sign a mutual agreement about shared accounts. It wasn't dramatic, it was adult, and that was enough. The Southeast London voice stayed with me. It was a reminder of a strange, costly chapter and of the strange ways the brain protects itself. It became part of how I told my story aloud when I talked at clinics, panels, or support meetings. People who heard me often thanked me for being open. Some said it helped them accept their own invisible conditions. I didn't get everything back, and some losses remained. But I found stability, a partner, meaningful work, and a community that understood the science and the grief behind FND. The voice that started as a medical mystery ended up as a tool, one that helped me teach others that the nervous system is complicated, that symptoms are real even when tests are clean, and that slow, steady work can build a different, honest life. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.